Amongst the more controversial miracles of the Bible are miracles that have to do with Jesus himself, and the first one of those is the virgin birth. Why is it that people have such a big problem with the virgin birth?
Obviously, if somebody, say some relative of mine were to approach me and say, "Hey, Chad, I'm pregnant, but there's no natural cause for this," and I would be skeptical. I recall a friend in the hospital, and they discovered that she was pregnant, and she was opposite, that she was not pregnant, and it was impossible, and they were like, "No, we know," and then she heard them talking to relatives out in the hall about it and stuff, and then it turned out she had a tumor, and she was telling the truth. But that obviously that'd be our first assumption, but here I think those who don't want to believe see a chink in the armor, or at least a place where they think there's a chink in the armor, and they can be like, "Aha, see, look here, Jesus was probably born to somebody who was doing stuff out of wedlock," and
So if we look at God being the author of life, then is God is doing something that he normally does. We attribute that to the properties, again, of certain things. The properties of the physical entities involved. But is that maybe the way that we should look at it?
Yeah, like I said, as a scientist, I can get very reductionist. We can talk about the process of fertilization and all this stuff. But again, at the high level, you can just be like God, and put the ultimate attribution there.
Why would it be maybe a misunderstanding of things just to see that the properties of the elements involved are responsible for this?
I think it might be the difference between seeing how something happens versus seeing why something happens.
Mm-hmm. And if we look at the way that a child develops in the womb, is all that stuff pretty simple, straightforward?
No, I mean, it is astoundingly complex, and obviously we have a fairly decent understanding of certain parts of it, as to how it's happening and stuff like this. But man, I don't know how you can look at that and not just see something miraculous.
Well, there's so many parts of it that we don't understand. I was watching something and they were talking about how some of the same cells that develop the spine and move around and develop the teeth, and they don't understand how that, like,
cells know to go there.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
How does they don't know anything about the way that happens, and it seems miraculous is maybe not too strong a word to describe some of the things that happen in that, and we have this interesting thing where Jesus is the Word, and he's the Word made flesh, and the word there has to do with not just kind of the spoken word, but the idea of thought and maybe distinction, differentiation, but also the idea of information. And so what role does information play in bringing about new life?
It plays everything. I mean, this is the heart of biology, right? We now, since the 1950s, understand that there is information built into every living creature in the form of DNA, and it's a digital code, and it's in the way that information is stored, it's not too different than the way our computer stores information, and that was somewhat surprising. But there's a fairly robust line of reasoning in intelligent design built around this information theory, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And where does that information come from?
It comes from God.
Well, if you're a scientist, where does it come from?
If you're a scientist, if you're an atheistic scientist, it comes from nowhere. And if you're ascribed to intelligent design, the idea is that the only examples where we can trace information to its source, and it always comes from an intelligent source. So to suggest that it's coming from something other than an intelligent source here is kind of...
Well, surely there's natural processes that we know of that bring about complexity and information, right? That the way that the world is just oriented in the way that it works, that just things naturally, as time progresses, they just get more and more ordered, more and more complex. This is just a natural process, right?
Yeah, if only it were so simple. There used to be a theory, I think, in about the 60s or 70s, and it was this theory in biochemistry that that it had to kind of happen this way. There are forces in nature that had to come this way, and now they know that this is completely false. And in fact, the author of that theory became a Christian.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And so, does the second law of thermodynamics play
Depends on who you talk to. It's funny because you can get around that second law of thermodynamics, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, and you can say that, well, everything that's going on with this body right now is no violation of the second law of thermodynamics. But I think the Christian's point is, well, let's go back to the beginning and get to this point and say, is there a violation of the second law somewhere in there? And definitely in looking at the second law of thermodynamics, and for those who aren't familiar, it's the idea that the world gets less and less ordered over time is one way to look at it, and it's a little more to it, but a nice conceptual way to look at it. And so in a world that's going to get less and less ordered over time, to think that something as complex as this is going to come about, and a lot of very complex things are going to come out, is highly unusual.
So the complexity that we see in the information in all living things, and the complexity that exists in us, it seems to go against the overall picture of how things operate. And so if you don't posit a God to be the author of that, then it's pretty hard to come up with another source for that, other than aliens.
Well, I once had a conversation with a student who didn't believe in God, and I said, well, but I said, well, what do you believe in? He's like, I believe in order. I'm like, well, you're just saying I already believe what I see exists, but you're not positing any sort of explanation for it. But he's like, well, I just believe in order. I'm like, oh, okay then.
Don't confuse me here. I got this. When we look at the resurrection, that seems to be another really big problem that people have with the Bible and looking at miracles. So how does the resurrection fit into this idea of seeing kind of what God is already in His character and nature doing? Does it violate any of the ideas about is this the point at which we get the crazy magic in the Bible?
No, and I think we get the idea in Scripture in the book of Genesis that God's foundational design for humans was not that they ever die, that they enjoy eternal fellowship with Him. And so I think in the resurrection, you're kind of seeing God's ultimate design finally unfolding.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting that the Bible speaks about, unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, and there's this element of the need for our fallen physical bodies to kind of be planted, so to speak, and put aside so that something greater can be given to us. And when you see Jesus resurrected, he seems to have some properties or qualities that seem unusual and almost magical to us. So what's happening with that?
It's like he can walk through walls. It seems to allude to and things of this sort. But it seems like in certain ways he's not bound by nature in ways that maybe we all still are and he was before. And I still don't know what to make of it all, because obviously he's still eating and drinking, and he can still point out the scars on his hands and things of this sort, but something is definitely different.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis posited that there's maybe different levels of spiritual and natural life, and that as you go toward God, you don't necessarily give up one level to reach the next, and that you might start existing in a deeper way that makes you both more spiritual and more physical. And that's an interesting thing when you look at Jesus and the miracles that he does and the command over nature he seems to have. And then after he's resurrected, the way that nature doesn't seem to have a hold on him, and yet he's still physical somehow. And so this points to something really interesting about what our lives will be like after resurrection. Is it a weird thing, or is it an impossible thing to think that we can somehow survive, that somehow something spiritualness survives death? Is there anything in the world that would maybe point us to the fact that that's a possibility?
Right. There's a whole host of people who are having their brains cryogenically frozen, right? Because they're in the hope that at some point they can take that and put it onto something else, whether that be some sort of body we create, or a robot, or but there is this idea that there is some sort of existence for you that maybe is even independent of your body, and then you got the idea that I think you pointed this out to me one time, that you know, all of the cells in your body and most of the atoms in your body are going to be recycled over the course of 7 years, and yet you're still you.
Yeah.
And so there's something beyond the pure physical that makes you you.